Welcome back. We're going to head into the second part of our lecture, which is some more in-depth features of the spinal cord. So when we look at the pattern of gray matter and white matter in the spinal cord, the gray matter, they decided to call it horns. So we're going to find some different horns here. So I'm going to highlight them here for you. So the dorsal horn is this area of gray matter back here. So we have one on each side because we are completely symmetrical. So that is the dorsal horn. So what are you going to find in the dorsal horn? That's where the neuron cell bodies that are receiving sensory information from the body are going to be located. So it's part of our sensory system. It's not the sensory neurons themselves that are the ones detecting stuff, but it's where we're receiving signals from them. Then we're going to find the ventral horn. So I'm going to do that one in red. So the ventral horn is the one that's kind of here towards the front or the anterior or ventral side of the spinal cord. And so the ventral horn is where we're going to find the cell bodies of motor neurons. So motor neurons are the neurons that are sending signals out to tell different things of our parts of our body to do something, most often telling muscles to contract. So that's the ventral horn. And then finally, we have the lateral horn, which is out here. I'm showing it in yellow. Sorry, I colored outside the lines. So we have the lateral horn, and the lateral horn is going to be important for the autonomic nervous system, which you might remember is our fight or flight, rest or digest, our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. We're going to have a whole unit on that later. So the gray matter is divided into those different horns. There's not any clear visual distinction between them, but we do find different types of neuron cell bodies living in them in those different regions. You also may notice that there's some gray matter out here in this little bubble. So this is actually the dorsal root ganglion. You may remember from a previous lecture that a ganglion is a collection of neuron cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. So they're actually in the peripheral nervous system, which is very unusual. It's exceedingly rare to have a neuron cell body living in the peripheral nervous system, but when they do so in a ganglion. So ganglion is the singular, ganglia is the plural. This happens to be part of what's called the dorsal root, so it is the dorsal root ganglion, and it is here that we're going to find the sensory neuron cell bodies that are actually the neurons that are bringing signals from the body, telling us about sensations that we are having. What about the white matter? So the white matter is divided into columns, and similarly, they are named for where they are located. So we've got dorsal columns, one on, oops, there we go. There's one. Here's the other one. We've got ventral columns up here and up here. And then we have lateral columns as well, which is kind of big. Now these are going to get subdivided into different things, so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. But I am going to point out that the dorsal columns are sensory only and the others are mixed. So you've got both sensory and motor. Now let's remind ourselves this is white matter. So that means these are myelinated axons that are traveling through here. And it just so happens this is a slice of the cucumber, but the axons are traveling up and down through it. So kind of like, is this where I have, oh, so here I animated a little thing. So you can almost see little dots, like there's tons of little axons coming up through this particular slice of the spinal cord. So you can think of it like straws, right? You've got all these columnar structures coming up. You've got all these little axons coming up and down. And so somebody thought, oh, they look kind of like columns on a building. So that's how they got named. So just remember, we're looking at a slice. These axons are coming up and down through that slice as they travel up and down through the spinal cord. And now the other thing we're going to find that's made out of white matter are the roots. Now the roots are not technically part of the spinal cord. They are technically part of the peripheral nervous system, but they're attached to the spinal cord. So we're going to talk about them too. So I love when things make sense and they kept with the same convention. So the dorsal root is here, and that is carrying the axons of the sensory neurons. And then we have, of course, on the other side, we have the ventral root, and that is carrying the axons of the motor neurons. Now, remember, the motor neurons are sending signals out. So these are efferent signals traveling out this way. And of course, the sensory is afferent, bringing signals into the central nervous system. I can't do, there we go. Okay, that's a sad looking arrow, sorry. Okay, so we've got, so it's kind of like we've got an off ramp and an on ramp, right? So things leaving the spinal cord and things coming into the spinal cord, just like coming on and off of the highway. Oh, there we go, dorsal root, ventral root. Now, you may have seen before that they actually come together. And when they come together, that is the spinal nerve. That is the spinal nerve that we were talking about before when we did basic anatomy. So if I'm a sensory neuron axon, I'm coming in from the body through the spinal nerve. The sensory neuron cell body is here. I'm not very good at this, but my axon then continues here. And then I'm going to send that signal. I'm going to have a synapse with some type of neuron then that's in that dorsal horn. Whereas if I am coming from a motor neuron in the ventral horn, right? So I've got a motor neuron here in the ventral horn, and it sends its axon out through the ventral root, and then it combines into this spinal nerve. So spinal nerves are mixed nerves, right? So they've got axons going each way. So to take our highway analogy a little bit farther, if we think of the central nervous system as like Interstate 94, so the really big highway with lots of lanes, and then maybe the spinal nerve is Route 25. So you have to take a special off-ramp or on-ramp to go between one and the other, but then we've got these two different directions right next to each other in that spinal nerve. That's Route 25. So you may have noticed that when I drew that sensory neuron, it was kind of weird because its cell body or soma was kind of like along the axon. Yes, they are weirdly shaped. So they are not like the multipolar neurons that we talked about way in the beginning of the class, where you've got this soma with all of its dendrites and then one axon leading away to axon terminals. Our sensory cells are often kind of bizarrely shaped, like here they show you what they call a pseudo-unipolar neuron. I'm not gonna, there's actually some controversy about exactly what to call the shape of these neurons, so I am not gonna make you learn that, but I just want you to acknowledge that these are differently shaped neurons. They're very different from what you're used to. We'll talk about them more when we do the somatosensory unit later in the course. So let's put it all together because it's kind of a good way to review. So in the ventral horn, we're going to have the cell bodies of motor neurons. So these are motor neurons. So they're going to send their axons out through this ventral root and then out through that spinal nerve, and the direction is this way, right? So I'm just going to do a little arrow. These are efferent. The direction is that way. Now, sensory information is coming in from the body, so it's going the opposite direction. Here I am on Route 25, and now I'm going to take the on-ramp to get onto the highway. Oh, but maybe there's a rest stop here, and that's where I can get a coffee. That's the cell body of my sensory neuron, but the axon continues through this dorsal root. And then it's going to arrive at the dorsal horn, where there's going to be another cell. Because remember, there has to be some type of cell body here. These are the cells that are, that green doesn't show up very well. These are the cells that are receiving that input from the sensory cell. Now, some of that information then is going to go up to the brain. So from here, some of that sensory information is going to be going up through axons that are going to go up from this level of the spinal cord up through those columns. And of course, the motor information, like if I'm purposefully flexing my fingers, that's coming from my brain. So you can also imagine then that we have motor axons. Where's my cursor? We have motor axons that are coming down from the, oops, wrong color, coming down from the brain through that ventral column, right? And they're coming down, and maybe they're coming down and telling this neuron, okay, fire, and tell this muscle to contract. So that's putting it all together. Here it is in text, right? So the gray matter is our neuron cell bodies. We have receivers of sensory signals in the dorsal horn, motor neuron cell bodies in the ventral horn, autonomic neurons in the lateral horn. And the sensory neuron cell bodies are weird, right? And they're out in those dorsal root ganglions. We've got axons traveling up and down through the dorsal, ventral, and lateral columns. And then we have those nerve roots, those kind of entry and exit ramps coming on and off from the spinal cord into the spinal nerves. And that's it for part 2. For part 3, we are going to talk about spinal reflexes.